Thanks very much, Vicki. Thanks for the invitation to be here. You know, it's good to celebrate Canadian immigration, and it feels good. We should do that. It's also good to see outsiders like The Economist celebrating also, but with the objectivity and realism of outsiders who have in a comparative perspective. And they did note that it is easier to be relaxed about immigration when your only land border has a wall on it the size of the United States. And they might have added that we got the Americans to pay for it. Particularly clever. I'm going to talk about the role of employers in immigrant selection. You know, Canada's always selected immigrants primarily for employability, from the days when our needs were for agricultural workers, and the probably apocryphal story was their hands were examined to be sure they had calluses on them. That was the qualification. To the time when our main need was for workers in manufacturing industries and construction, and workers were recruited from countries with good supplies of tradesmen, to the implementation of the points system, which codified the concept of employability to fit a modern economy following human capital theory. But in recent years, it's become a standard feature of immigration policy to significantly increase the involvement of employers directly in the selection of immigrants. Rather than select immigrants for employability, they're selected directly by employers who have already employed them. This is seen in three aspects of our immigration policy: in the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program, in the Canada Experience class, where temporary workers in certain instances are eligible to apply for permanent status, and in the express entry system, where employers can select potential immigrants from an expression of interest pool. Reliance on employers for a significant part of immigrant selection is really a new feature of Canadian immigration. Actually, it's new anywhere, and there are no models for Canada to follow in this regard. The Australian and New Zealand experience is often cited, and also the American experience, which is less often cited, is they are not really a full exploration of issues from a Canadian perspective, because none of these countries have a program of employer participation on the scale of what has been contemplated for Canada. So I think it's something that we should examine carefully. There are obvious advantages if we bring in people when Canadians are not available for the work, and especially in the case of highly skilled immigrants, if they arrive with jobs in hand, it reduces what has been the biggest problem of immigrant program over at least 2 decades, which is immigrants unable to find jobs in their field of training due to, for example, lack of recognition of qualifications, a brain waste issue. But of course, if employers as private citizens are going to have a role in immigrant selection, then we have to be aware that they are operating from their own personal situation, not as public servants. So we have to somehow be sure that the public interest is served and that there is some accountability. So that means some supervision, evaluation, and so on, which adds costs to the program. It's not a case of privatizing means private sector bears all the costs. So the question is, what degree of supervision is required, and when this additional cost is factored in, is it worth it? And then there's also a partly separate but related question of how the immigration program actually fits into the priorities of employers filling positions that arise in their organizations. To what extent is it realistic to expect employers to be interested in using the immigration program for this purpose? So if you look at some of these issues, I think that there are problems that arise in all three of these areas that I just mentioned that suggest we take a closer look. Regarding the advantages, it seems that from a report published by Garnet-Picot and Feng Hu at StatCan, permanent immigrants arriving with a job in hand, like we would get from the Canada Experience class or Express Entry, have some advantages, but they're not very large and have often been offset by declines overall in immigrant earnings. And they also may be short-lived. This actually fits with the Australian research on immigrants who were temporary and converted to permanent. They did better, but their spouses did not. And this could be for a number of reasons, but it's a caution against thinking that employer involvement would make a decisive difference. Second, there have been controversies arising from the role of employers. These are mainly in the case of the temporary foreign worker program. suggesting that what was seen as effective monitoring over the course of the expansion of the program from 100,000 to 400,000 a year was maybe not what was really needed. Actually, I want to look at this because the identification of problems in the program have been mainly media-driven, which, as the minister pointed out, is not necessarily covering all of the things that are actually happening. Initially, it was supposed to be just in the restaurant business where there were problems, but it became clear that the basic defects were broader, and the program was actually scaled way back, and we've had a review of temporary foreign worker program. It's not clear what the new replacement program will be. But the problems stem from inadequate supervision of the employer role in immigrant selection. And this affects many aspects of the temporary foreign worker program and also the permanent immigrant program. I don't think we should wait for the media to discover these problems. We should have a good understanding of the situation as the programs are developed. And then third, regarding employer priorities in relation to the international immigration program, there have been generally disappointing numbers of immigrants that have been brought in as selected by employers, either through the candidate experience class and express entry. It's never gone over about 15, 17,000. And I think myself that this is actually fairly predictable, given that both of these programs, there is really a mismatch between the program, what the program offers, and what the employers actually need. In a nutshell, temporary foreign workers is fulfilling temporary jobs, or it's supposed to be if we do it right, so it may be that the transition to permanent is not a likely outcome. If the jobs they were doing are permanent, then they aren't supposed to be in the temporary foreign worker program. And then regarding express entry, employers who want to fill top-level positions in their organization and want to look abroad often have to go out and persuade those people to come to Canada. They're not going to be found in an expression of interest pool since they are not among those lining up to come to Canada. So again, the program doesn't fit the needs of many or most employers who want to fill skilled positions using an international search. All in all, what I'm suggesting is that when we look at what is required for employer involvement, I think maybe we have been expecting too much of this area, and we should try to assess what is the extent to which employers can be expected to be usefully involved. It's particularly true when we contemplate substantial increases in immigration. If we have a more realistic expectation for employer involvement, we may find the need to refocus more of our attention on that nagging problem of integrating skilled immigrants who do not arrive with jobs, rather than seizing on the hope that we will somehow be able to bring in most immigrants already with jobs. So I want to expand on these themes a little bit and discuss some of the problems involving the employer role in more detail. Regarding the temporary foreign worker program, the controversies have been regarding the low-skilled workers doing fairly menial jobs. So regarding wages, when Canadians are not available for these jobs, it's of course not because of skill shortages, but because the jobs are unattractive. So since Canadians do work at all kinds of jobs, including menial jobs, it may be mostly a question of the rate of pay. We all know that the request to bring in workers was supposed to be vetted in terms of the impact on the Canadian labor market. But there were cases publicized where employers were supposed to be bringing in foreign workers when Canadians were not available. It turned out, at least in a restaurant in Saskatchewan, the Canadians were already working in the jobs and were being replaced by the foreigners at lower wages. So this seemed to be a question of rules not effectively enforced. Actually, the rules themselves were sometimes not what one might have expected if Canadian public interests were to be served, because the foreign workers were approved if they were working at wages at least 85% of what Canadians were paid. But this is obviously going to undercut Canadian wage rates. So this was abolished, but it illustrated that you need rules and you have to enforce them. But the program was suspended, and only now is the government returning to the temporary foreign worker program, trying to decide what rules should be in place. And there are pressures to make the temporary foreign workers easier to access. However, one question is, if temporary foreign workers are needed not because the job is temporary and not because Canadians are not available to take well-paying jobs, but because the employer hopes to pay wages they used to pay but are now below market because rents and other household expenses are so high. I don't know if the temporary foreign worker program rules should be drawn up in consultation with labor groups or social welfare professionals, but certainly in determining whether Canadians are available for the job, some attention should be given to the issue of wages and wages above the poverty level. There have been other controversies related to temporary foreign worker program, which have been less in the media, but on which there is some research. One question is maintaining employment standards during the period of employment. One advantage cited in the media for the temporary foreign worker programs is that foreign workers have a better work ethic than Canadians. But others point out that any worker will work hard if the employer has the right to have them deported if they do not. Maybe if they are maybe they are under unfair pressures. And again, there is the problem of ensuring that this is not simply opening up possibilities for the use of these persons that is not part of the public interest. There's only one way to find this out, and that's to examine situations closely. And there have been government evaluations showing that participants in temporary foreign worker programs express satisfaction that most believe they are treated fairly. However, these evaluations where foreign workers are in a vulnerable position filling out questionnaires from an official-looking source, they may not be the best way to get an honest answer, plus the workers may not actually know what their rights are. My colleague at the University of Toronto, Patricia Landolt, and her collaborators have published some of their work on precarious employment of immigrants, and these issues of employer abuse of power they wield over workers with uncertain visa status seem quite widespread in their data. The problem of employers extracting concessions or fees from workers in exchange for supporting their bid for transition to permanent status is something that I haven't heard about in the Canadian program. I'm not sure how you prevent it. It certainly was a flagrant problem in the US immigrant amnesty program of the 1980s, so I just mentioned it as a theoretical possibility. Another question in the case of low-skilled workers is whether when their visa expires, they actually leave the country. This is an assumption of the program, and again, it is not only there's a little way to enforce this, there's actually no information on whether it actually happens because we don't record exits from Canada. If the job continues, then for as long as that's the case, one may say, who cares if they're undocumented workers in Canada? However, we certainly know from the experience in the US that large numbers of unskilled and undocumented workers can be a problem, and there is a significant debate as to whether it's in the public interest. There are some who believe that the positive Canadian attitudes to immigration generally have a lot to do with the fact that we have no substantial undocumented population, and that foreign-born persons who are living and working in Canada have official authorization of some kind for that. If the job doesn't continue and the undocumented worker remains unemployed in Canada, then for the Canadian taxpayer, that's just tough. The employers had what they want in the short term. Any burdens for unskilled unemployed foreigners in Canada falls to the taxpayer. How significant is this? Well, we actually have no estimates of the numbers of undocumented immigrants in Canada. The numbers in the US are there, they have them, but that's been made because of political pressures from localities to know the full size of the populations they serve. But I could make an estimate. If half of the foreign workers, unskilled, overstayed their visas, then if there were, in some years, 100,000 unskilled temporary foreign workers coming in per year, this would be 50,000 undocumented a year, resulting eventually. In the proportional terms, this would be comparable to the flow of undocumented Mexicans into the US at the high point when it was about 500,000 a year, which would be the same number on a per capita basis. So for the Canadian experience class and the express entry system, there have been controversies, but nothing like in the temporary foreign worker program. Generally, the higher skilled workers are less vulnerable to exploitation. The question of visa compliance is not as great, and also the labor standards, since these people are perceived at least as having options. The programs leading to permanent status have been about more high-skilled workers. How does employer participation in the selection of individual high-skilled workers affect the flow of immigrants, and is the public interest affected? Some have suggested that the employers may exercise a degree of racial discrimination. This was suggested by the Australian experience, where the employer-selected immigrants were much more often from white countries. Remember that it is the employer's skepticism about the skills of immigrants with foreign qualifications that's one of the main factors involved in the skill utilization issues, so it would not be surprising to find employers apply these same views to the expression of interest profiles. The extent of racial discrimination in the Canadian labor market is, I think, still underappreciated. The evidence from the extensive discrimination audit of 2008 in Toronto and Montreal, involving 13,000 resumes, showed that putting an Asian name on a resume reduced the chances of a callback for an interview by over 30%, even if all of the qualifications on the resume were Canadian, and reduced it by a factor of 2 to 3 times when the qualifications were foreigner. It gives you an idea of how extensive discrimination can be when it's practiced in a way which is invisible. So what this means is that to the extent that discounting applications from people with foreign backgrounds is unfair, the express entry procedure enables Canadian employers to practice this unfairness right at the entry gate. True, we don't have the same problem within Canada, but we still have the same degree of unfairness. It's just that the people who are being unfairly treated are not in the country and don't represent a problem. I mentioned that the numbers overall of employers' involvement is disappointing, and there may be a mismatch between the needs of employers when they search internationally and the system we offer, which allows only them to search for people who've already decided they want to go to Canada. In my own field, by the way, when we recruit internationally at the university, I think the overlap there is between the category and those we want to recruit is probably close to 0. So maybe what was needed is an expansion of the opportunity to search internationally and then apply for permanent status for the person we find. The U.S. labor certification scheme on this works quite well, I think, allowing for just this option. What's interesting is that the number of immigrants they get this way, about 150 to 175,000 a year, that's significant for them, but the parallel demand in Canada would be a tenth of that, so that's less than 20,000. That would not be sufficient for the size of the Canadian immigration program. So what I think this suggests is that the whole hope that employers can be meaningfully involved in large-scale recruitment requires review and analysis, and taking account of the costs of properly monitoring and vetting proposals and in the temporary foreign worker program, and taking account of the interests of employers will have when the program is properly run, leads to the question, is it realistic to expect this will happen? In our program today, most permanent immigrants are still selected in the traditional way based on points or comprehensive ranking scheme or whatever. A lot of selection is going on provincially. Maybe we could have another talk on the role of the provinces in immigrant selection, but I think some of the comments that I've made apply. I think we should not see the points-selected immigration as something that is being phased out or eventually replaced by an employer-based system. This may happen, but as yet we don't have a good theory about why it should happen. And I think especially when there are monitoring and controls to reduce the negative aspects, including discriminatory review of applications, we may find that the employer interest is even less. So I think, one of the expressions that I use is that, the point system of selecting immigrants on the basis of their employability, the point of the point system was that we were bringing in a lot of people who do not have jobs, and we're never going to be able to arrange jobs for all those folks in advance. And so the point system there is to enable them to be able to find jobs once they're here in Canada. So we have to go back, I think, to realize that the programs of integrating skilled immigrants who lack jobs when they arrive is part of the future of the Canadian immigration program, and will probably be more important in the future when the size of the program expands. Thank you.